Welcome back. If you've been enjoying these quiet walks through the darker corners of history, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell icon so you don't miss the next time we unearth something disturbing, forgotten, or just plain filthy. I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from tonight. Drop your location in the comments below, and let's see just how far this strange little journey reaches. Now, get comfortable, settle in, because tonight we're going to take a slow, detailed descent into the grime, the odor, and the true horror of medieval hygiene. No, it's not what you learned in textbooks. It's far worse. The Middle Ages, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, were not a single unchanging block of filth and fleas. Hygiene practices varied wildly by region, class, religion, and even weather. But overall, one truth remains. If you found yourself suddenly transported back in time to a medieval city, village, monastery, or even a royal court, you'd smell it before you saw it, and you'd never forget it. Let's begin at the surface. Bathing. A word that today implies cleanliness, relaxation, maybe even luxury. But in the medieval world, bathing was controversial, inconsistent, and often, ironically, considered dangerous. Early in the Middle Ages, particularly in the remnants of the Roman Empire, public bathhouses still existed. Some were relics of Roman-designed stone buildings with steam rooms, hot pools, and cold plunges. Others were simpler, wooden huts near rivers or hot springs. Men and women sometimes bathed together, though this varied depending on location and decade. And while this communal cleansing might sound progressive, it was often more about socializing, gossip, or even sex work than hygiene. But as the centuries wore on, particularly with the rise of Christian morality and the fear of vanity and lust, public baths came under fire. Religious leaders preached that excessive concern with the body was sinful. Nakedness, even for cleansing, became suspect. And bathhouses began to close not because people preferred to be dirty, but because cleanliness became associated with immorality. The result? People started bathing less, a lot less. Some still washed their hands and faces. A few nobles might have perfumed linen cloths or dry baths, rubbing their bodies with fabrics soaked in scented alcohol. But full immersion in water? Rare, suspicious, and often replaced by powder, perfumes, or prayers. This shift was compounded by another fear, that water itself could make you sick. In an era when germ theory did not exist, people believed that illness traveled through bad air miasmas. Opening one's pores in a hot bath, it was thought, allowed these poisonous airs to seep in. Better to stay dry and layered than risk exposure. So instead of cleansing, many people masked. A noblewoman might change her camise often, layering clean linen to absorb sweat and odor. A peasant might scrape their skin with a dull knife, removing visible grime but little else. And everyone, noble or not, would be surrounded by the smells of sweat, rot, and waste. Speaking of waste, let us descend slowly, carefully, into the world of toilets. Or rather, the medieval lack thereof. Most people relieved themselves in chamber pots. If they lived in a castle or manor, that pot might be emptied into a cesspit or moat. If they lived in a town or city, it might be dumped directly into the street. Laws existed against this, of course. In some cities, you could be fined for tossing your waste from a window without first shouting a warning. But enforcement was rare, and rain was expected to do the rest. The result? Streets slick with filth, alleyways reeking of ammonia, flies, rats, and the constant risk of stepping in something warm and very much alive. In monasteries, waste was more carefully managed. Some had primitive latrines, stone seats over running water, but even there, hygiene was minimal. Monks might bathe only a few times a year, and cleanliness was considered more a spiritual matter than a physical one. For peasants, toilets were holes in the ground, sometimes surrounded by wooden planks, sometimes not. The smell was unbearable. But worse, these pits often leached into water supplies, contaminating wells and spreading disease. Speaking of disease, let's talk about plague, and not just the Black Death of the 14th century. Disease was a constant companion in the Middle Ages. dysentery, leprosy, typhus, worms, pox. And with no real understanding of infection, people turned to superstitions for protection. They wore amulets, burned herbs, carried sweet-smelling sachets, and yes, they bled themselves. Hygiene, as we think of it, was largely absent from these equations. Clean hands did not ward off plague. A well-scrubbed floor did not prevent cholera. And so, few bothered. Even surgeons and midwives operated with filthy instruments. Open wounds were packed with spider webs, dung, or whatever was believed to draw out bad humors. Teeth pulled with pliers. Rotting stumps left in. Mouthwash, when used, was made from vinegar, salt, or even urine. Yes, urine. Which brings us to one of the strangest truths of medieval hygiene. Bodily fluids were everywhere. Urine was used to clean clothes, to tan leather, to cure wounds. Saliva was believed to heal sores. Menstrual blood was feared, but also used in folk remedies. And feces? Sometimes applied to wounds or used in magic. These were not jokes, they were beliefs, born of desperation and the absence of science. Children were raised in this world, born into it. They crawled on dirty floors, sucked on fingers washed in well water. They died often, and if they survived, they learned to ignore the smells, to accept the filth, to pretend it was normal, because it was. In the chapters ahead, we'll explore specific elements of medieval hygiene in even greater detail, how people cleaned their homes, their clothes, their food, how beauty and cleanliness were intertwined with sin, shame, and superstition, and how, beneath the dirt, there was still dignity, still humanity, still people trying, in their own limited ways, to stay clean in a world that seemed determined to make them dirty. But for now, rest. Breathe slowly. You're not in a medieval village. You're here. Safe, warm, clean. And the story is only beginning. Let us now travel deeper, not just into the medieval world, but into its corners, crevices, and quiet daily habits that shape the scent, the filth, and the routines of everyday life. We began with bodies and waste. But to understand how terrible hygiene truly was, we need to examine the spaces people lived in their homes, their bedding, their clothes, and how they attempted, often feebly, to control dirt, parasites, and decay. Picture a peasant's home. A single room, perhaps two if they were lucky. A dirt floor. A central hearth, smoky and unevenly hot. No windows, only wooden shutters. Roofs of thatch, which dripped in the rain and were often riddled with insects and birds. Livestock lived indoors, chickens underfoot, goats in the corner, perhaps even a cow if the weather turned. These animals were vital for survival, but their presence meant constant excrement, constant fleas, constant noise. The floor was rarely swept, and even when it was, dust, ash, and manure particles remained. In winter, dry dung was burned for warmth. In summer, waste piled in corners or in the yard. There were no soaps, no disinfectants, no cleaning sprays. Ash and sand were sometimes used to scrub surfaces, but mostly filth accumulated. Rats made their nests in corners, lice bred in clothing, and in this, children were born. Women gave birth on straw, often reused from earlier labors. Afterbirth was sometimes buried, sometimes not. The same mat might be used again within weeks, barely cleaned, if at all. And so infections spread from mother to child to midwife, from family to neighbor. Bedding was a luxury. Most peasants slept on straw stuffed into coarse sacks. That straw was not replaced often. It grew damp, moldy, filled with fleas. Nobles fared little better. They had feather beds, but no knowledge of mites. Curtains hung around beds were rarely washed. Chamber pots were emptied by servants, sometimes into pits, sometimes not. Odors clung to everything: curtains, carpets, skin. And while they bathed slightly more often, nobles also wore layer upon layer of clothing, trapping sweat and oils. Clothes for both rich and poor were rarely washed. Water was precious. Soap was expensive. Washing garments meant scrubbing them by hand in cold rivers, often with harsh lye or ashes, and then drying them over bushes or stones. The effort was immense. And so clothes were simply worn again and again. Stains became permanent. Odors, too. In noble households, servants might air garments, shaking them out and applying perfumes or herbs. But this masked, rather than removed, the filth. Shoes, rarely worn by peasants, offered little protection. Feet were often bare, cracked, infected. Toenails grew wild, blisters festered. Clean water to rinse feet was rare, and the idea of washing one's feet before bed, a luxury reserved for scripture and saints. Hair care was no better. Combs were used to remove lice, but rarely washed. Ointments made of animal fat, herbs, or ash were rubbed into the scalp to hide the smell. Wigs were seldom cleaned. Hats absorbed years of sweat. And shaving, especially for men, was erratic. Razors were crude, often dull. Soap was minimal. Cuts became infected. Beards were trimmed with knives shared among many. And then came the real terror parasites. Lice, fleas, mites, worms, all common, all accepted. Children were born with lice and grew up scratching their scalps until scabs formed. Adults, too, scratched in silence, ashamed but powerless. Bedbugs infested even royal beds. Fleas spread plague. And intestinal worms were considered normal paw, set from mother to child, from food to mouth, from finger to soil. Few knew the cause. Fewer had a cure. And so they endured. Picked nits from each other's hair. Dug worms from stool. Scratched at bites in church. They endured because they had no choice. Water, when used, was not clean. Wells were contaminated. Rivers ran with waste. In cities, gutters overflowed. Rain mixed with rot. And when a bucket was drawn, no one asked what lay upstream. Filters did not exist. Boiling was rare. People drank what they had, and many died from it. Milk soured quickly. Ale was safer. And so even children drank weak beer because it killed fewer than water did. The very act of quenching thirst carried risk. And yet life continued. Meals were prepared on dirty surfaces, hands were wiped on aprons, or not at all. Knives were shared. Salted meat was infested. Bread bore mold. And in the absence of knowledge, people turned to ritual, prayers before meals, crosses over water, superstition instead of sanitation. Yet even in this filth, there was order, a rhythm, a strange resilience. People developed tolerance. Immune systems strengthened, or failed. They adapted, not out of wisdom, but out of necessity. And in time, they forgot what clean even meant. To be clean was not to be free of dirt. It was to be socially acceptable, smelling like one's neighbors, scrubbing before Mass, changing a tunic at Easter. These were the standards. These were enough. But we must not confuse survival with comfort, or adaptation with health. Life was hard. It was short, and it was dirty, unspeakably dirty. In the next part, we will explore how religious beliefs shaped hygiene, how purity became moral rather than physical, and how the body, sacred, sinful, smelly, was treated with awe, fear, and confusion. For now, close your eyes. Imagine the scratch of straw, the hum of flies, the taste of salted meat. You are safe. You are clean. But they were not. And their story is far from over. As we draw further into the shadowy folds of medieval life, it becomes clear that hygiene was never simply a matter of dirt and water, but rather a complex web woven from fear, belief, ritual, and survival. In this part of our journey, let us pause and look more closely at the role of religion, and how it influenced not only the way people thought about cleanliness, but how they physically experienced their own bodies. Medieval Europe was soaked in Christian doctrine. The church was everywhere, in cities and towns, in villages and fields, in homes and in thoughts. Its words shaped laws, habits, and notions of purity. Cleanliness, according to many religious thinkers, was not necessarily of the flesh, but of the soul. To bathe the body too often, to linger in one's reflection, or to anoint oneself in oils was dangerously close to vanity. And vanity, in turn, was a sin. For monks and nuns, especially, asceticism was a virtue. They often avoided bathing altogether, not out of ignorance, but as a conscious rejection of the world's temptations. Dirt became a kind of badge proof that they were above physical pleasures. The smell of their labor, their unwashed robes, the grease of their uncombed hair, these were offerings to God. But even among the laypeople, the idea that suffering and filth brought one closer to holiness was not uncommon. Pilgrims trudged for weeks without washing. Saints were often described as enduring terrible filth, lice, and rot as signs of their spiritual strength. One hagiography tells of a woman so holy that her lice refused to bite her, another of a man who never bathed, and whose odor drove away temptation. Cleanliness, then, was not a goal, it was a distraction. In this environment, the sacraments of the Church became the only necessary purification. Confession cleansed the soul. Baptism replaced the need to scrub a newborn. Last rites substituted for a final bath. In fact, washing the body after death was sometimes skipped entirely. Corpses were wrapped quickly, the scent masked with herbs, and buried with prayers. The body was a temporary shell. What mattered was the soul, and the soul, it was taught, did not require soap. Yet this doctrine did not exist in a vacuum. It blended, curiously, with older pagan beliefs. In some rural areas, people still practice cleansing rituals with herbs, fire, or river water. May Day festivities included symbolic washes. Weddings might involve a ceremonial bath. But these customs were often condemned or co-opted by the Church, transformed into metaphors rather than practices. The result was confusion. People knew they were dirty. They felt it, smelled it, saw it. But they also feared that cleaning too much might open them to sin. A woman scrubbing her arms too eagerly might be accused of pride. A man soaking in a tub might be suspected of lust, and so they held back. They covered the smell with rosemary, sage, or lavender. They carried pomanders, small balls of scented wax, or herbs tied to belts or rosaries. They burned incense, and they prayed. Cleanliness, they believed, could be achieved through grace, not water. This belief extended to childbirth, where the midwife's prayers were often more important than her instruments. To illness, where repentance was valued above poultices. And to burial, where the dead were dressed in their best clothes but rarely bathed. Even holy relics, the bones of saints, their robes, their preserved fingers were kept in ornate containers but seldom cleaned. Dust was seen not as filth, but as time, and time, they believed, was sacred. But beyond religion, there was also ignorance. With no microscopes, no germ theory, no sense of bacteria or viruses, people simply didn't understand why they got sick. Illness came from God, or demons, or bad blood. The foul air theory that disease spread through miasmas. Invisible vapors led to a different kind of cleanliness, the cleanliness of smell. If something smelled good, it must be healthy. If it stank, it must be deadly. This belief, while wrong, shaped medieval hygiene more than any other. People wore flowers in their clothes. They stuffed herbs into pillows. They chewed cloves, carried mint, and even filled their noses with sponges soaked in vinegar when they passed through towns during plague times. Doctors wore the famous plague masks, not to protect themselves from germs, but to filter out bad smells. The long beak was stuffed with aromatics, rose petals, cinnamon, juniper, camphor. It may have helped, a little, but it was no cure. Still, in a world where death could come from a simple cough or a bite on the ankle, this illusion of control brought comfort, and so people clung to it. They swept floors not to remove germs, but to lift the air. They hung garlands to banish miasmas. They sang hymns in sick rooms, and they burned wood, not for warmth, but to purify. It was a kind of magic, a hopeful gesture. And like many medieval gestures, it was both wrong and beautiful. But even in this confusion, glimmers of true cleanliness appeared. In some cities, bathhouses persisted longer than in others. In Islamic Spain, for instance, hygiene was taken far more seriously, influenced by religious prescriptions for washing before prayer. In Jewish communities, the mikveh provided ritual immersion and some physical cleansing. These traditions clashed with broader Christian suspicion toward water, but they offered alternatives, whispers of a different path. Even in monasteries, where bathing was rare, rules sometimes dictated washing hands before meals, feet before sleep, and heads on holy days. Not because it removed dirt, but because it honored the body. And from these faint routines, modern hygiene would eventually emerge. But not yet. In the centuries we've explored tonight, to be clean was to be humble. To be filthy was to be faithful. And in between, there was only habit, scent, and prayer. As we close this chapter, imagine the heavy robes, the layers of dust, the solemn hymns echoing through air thick with incense and unwashed skin. You are not there. You are safe and clean. But those people were not. And still, they lived. Still, they prayed. Still, they endured. Sleep well. We will continue soon. To understand just how truly terrible medieval hygiene was, we must go beyond the walls of cottages and castles, past the chambers of priests and the routines of peasants, and into the wider public world, into cities and towns, marketplaces and roadsides, where the collective habits of entire populations turned everyday life into a teeming tapestry of smells, sounds, and invisible hazards. In the heart of a medieval town, the streets were narrow and winding, their stones uneven, their surfaces sticky with age-old grime. There was no pavement as we know it, just layers upon layers of waste, trampled straw, mud, horse dung, urine, and rotting food. Rain turned it into sludge, sun baked it into crust, and people walked through it daily. There were no public waste disposal systems, no garbage trucks, no centralized sanitation. Instead, refuse was tossed from windows, an act so common it had its own etiquette. A shout would be given, "Gardez l'eau!" a warning to anyone passing below that a bucket of filth was about to be emptied onto the street. And yet, despite these calls, many passers-by were not spared. Chamber pots rained down onto alleys. Bones and scraps were thrown into gutters. Rotten vegetables mixed with animal entrails, and pigs, allowed to roam freely in some towns, snuffled through it all, spreading disease with their hooves and snouts. In marketplaces, the filth multiplied. Butchers slaughtered animals on the spot. Blood drained into the dirt. Skins and offal piled up. Fishmongers gutted their catch beside barrels of brine and flies. Bakers swept ashes into corners. Brewers dumped slops into drains that led nowhere. And between all of this, people sold bread, cloth, candles, spices. Flies landed on everything. Rats darted between stalls. The air was thick with the mingled scent of hot meat, sour milk, and unwashed bodies. Even in churches, those supposed sanctuaries of purity, the filth crept in. Worshippers tracked in dirt. Incense mixed with the smell of sweat. Floors were rarely cleaned. Pews became host to fleas. And in some cases, animals wandered inside. Cats, dogs, birds. The sacred and the profane mingled daily. Not out of blasphemy, but because there were no boundaries strong enough to keep nature out. Public baths, once common during the Roman era and still clinging to life in the early medieval period, fell into decline. Where they did exist, they were communal, crowded, and often associated with sin. Gossip circulated that bathhouses encouraged lust, that too much heat weakened the body, that water, if stagnant, could carry illness. Slowly, public washing became suspect, and so people stopped going. The bathhouses closed, the tiles cracked, the pools dried up, and with them, an entire culture of cleansing faded. Latrines, too, were crude. In many homes, they were simply pits dug outside. In castles, they were built into walls, chutes that dropped waste directly into the moat or down a tower side. In towns, public latrines existed, but they were few, filthy, and often overwhelmed. In some cities, cesspits were shared between multiple homes. These pits filled quickly, When they overflowed, they were either abandoned or shoveled out by gong farmers men paid to remove human waste, often at night with carts and shovels. It was dangerous work. The fumes could suffocate, the pits could collapse, and the stench clung to their skin, their clothes, their lives. They were outcasts, yet essential, and still the waste returned. Always. Because there were no sewers, no infrastructure, just holes in luck. The water people used came from wells or streams, but these, too, were vulnerable. Wells were often located near latrines. Leaching occurred. Rain carried waste into streams. And even when water looked clean, it carried invisible dangers. Yet people used it for drinking, cooking, washing. Boiling was rare, firewood precious. And so illness spread. Dysentery, cholera, typhoid. Diseases we now associate with contaminated water were rampant. Children died often. Adults weakened. And still, the source remained a mystery. Some towns attempted regulations. Laws were passed forbidding the dumping of waste in the streets. Rules were written about when and where butchers could operate. Bakers were fined for selling burnt loaves. Tanners were pushed to city edges. But enforcement was weak. Bribes were common, and desperation trumped order. People did what they could to survive. That meant selling spoiled meat, watering wine, reusing bandages, washing wounds with spit. Life was precarious. The body, a constant battlefield. And the city? A massive, pulsing organism of dirt. But amid this chaos, strange rituals emerged. Market stalls were sometimes sprinkled with herbs. Doorways were swept with charms. Women tied rosemary to belts, believing it would ward off illness. Children were given amulets. Beggars blessed those who offered bread. And every few years, when the filth became unbearable, processions were held, public prayers, chants, and parades, asking God to cleanse the town. Bells rang, incense burned, and the streets, briefly, fell silent. Then, back to life. Back to filth. In winter, the smells lessened, masked by frost, but waste built beneath snow. In spring, it thawed. The stench returned. So did disease, and so did death. Through all of it, people endured. They worked, laughed, married, gave birth, died. The filth became background noise, the terrible normal. And still, hygiene never meant what it does now. It meant survival. It meant adaptation. It meant doing the best one could with a wooden bucket, a patch of soap, and a prayer. We will continue soon. To grasp how far the medieval world was from modern ideas of hygiene, we must enter the most intimate spaces of the body and the habits that surrounded it, the rituals of grooming, the tools of cleanliness, and the routines that were often dictated not by science, but by superstition, scarcity, and necessity. There was no toothbrush in the way we know it today. Instead, people chewed sticks from certain trees like hazel or birch, fraying the ends until they became soft enough to scrape plaque and food from the teeth. Charcoal was sometimes rubbed on the gums, not because it was known to kill bacteria, but because it gave the mouth a cleaner feel. Ashes from fire or crushed eggshells were also common. Yet despite these rudimentary practices, tooth decay was rampant. Diets were high in carbohydrates, coarse bread, porridge, ale, and low in dental knowledge. Sweetened mead and honey were popular. Flossing did not exist, cavities festered, gums receded, breath turned sour. And when the pain became unbearable, a local blacksmith or barber would step in with iron tongs and no anesthesia. One swift tug, often several. Blood, shouting, and silence. Hair was another battleground. Head lice were a constant companion, not just among the poor, but among nobles as well. Combs were made of wood or bone, their teeth thick and coarse, suitable more for detangling than for delousing. Some women covered their heads with linen wimples or veils to hide grease. Men shaved their tonsures but did not always wash the scalp. Barbers performed haircuts and minor surgeries alike. They lanced boils, drained cysts, applied poultices to festering wounds, all without gloves, without sterilization, without even boiling their instruments. Beards were trimmed, but not cleaned. Scalp infections spread. Dandruff was mistaken for divine punishment. Ointments made of goose fat and crushed herbs were used, more often to mask smell than to heal. Fingernails were rarely trimmed, toenails even less. Soap, when it could be found, was harsh. Made of animal fat and lye, it burned the eyes, cracked the skin, and left a bitter scent. A bar of soap was a luxury. Most families could not afford it. Instead, they used sand to scrub their hands, or ashes, or nothing at all. In many homes, washing hands was done only before meals, and only if guests were present. Water would be poured by a servant over a basin. A towel shared by all, one cloth, one bowl, dozens of fingers. No one thought this strange. It was normal. The skin, too, suffered. Without moisturizers, it dried. Without bathing, it itched. Without change of clothes, it festered. Children developed rashes that never went away. Women wore layers of fabric to soak sweat and hide stains. Men rarely removed their outer garments, even to sleep. Underwear was sometimes not worn at all. The idea of changing clothing daily was unheard of. Linen was precious. Laundering was labor. And so, garments soaked in oils, sweat, urine, and filth hung heavy on bodies for weeks, even months. In winter, people wore more, not cleaner. In summer, they stank more, not less. Perfumes were used by the rich not to prevent odor, but to disguise it. Rosewater, musk, civet, extracted from animals. These scents clung to skin and hair, mingling with the musk of rot. Baths were rare and often social. In some cities, families bathed together. In others, men and women visited separate bathhouses or even shared them, until the church began to crack down. Bathing naked, they said, encouraged lust. Better to wash in parts. Hands today, feet next week, head on holy days, the full body, perhaps once a year. And even then, the water was not clean, it was reused. A whole family might share the same tub. Father first, then sons, then mother, then daughters. The youngest last, the water, by then, brown and cloudy. In some homes, water was heated over fire, carried by hand, poured into a wooden tub, then dumped in the street. No drains, no plumbing, just buckets and sweat. And for many, even that was too much trouble. Instead, they washed in rivers. Or didn't wash at all. It wasn't just rural people who lived this way. In castles, royalty had bathtubs, but they used them sparingly. A queen might bathe 3 times in her life at birth, before marriage, and before death. Nobles had servants to wipe them with cloths soaked in herbs. They believed washing opened the pores to disease. Better to seal them with oils. In cities, some bathhouses remained, especially in places with Islamic influence. But elsewhere, the sight of steaming water became a rarity. Illness was misunderstood, hygiene feared, and so the body was left to crust, to weep, to smell. And yet, in this murk, life went on. Lovers courted, children played, festivals roared through town squares, and always, beneath it all, was the ever-present scent of a world untouched by the modern sense of cleanliness, the world of medieval hygiene. And still, we have not reached its depths. We continue soon. And now we must peer into the final realm of medieval hygiene, the emotional, social, and spiritual dimensions that guided people's ideas of purity and filth. For it was not simply that the Middle Ages lacked soap or plumbing or medical knowledge. It was that the very concept of cleanliness was shaped by entirely different values. In medieval minds, purity was often more moral than physical. A clean soul outweighed a clean body. Sin was a stain more terrifying than sweat. The church taught that suffering cleansed the spirit, and so to endure filth patiently was considered virtuous. Monks went unwashed as acts of piety. Saints were admired for stinking. There were tales of holy men who never bathed, whose lice were called pearls of God, whose wounds festered but healed through prayer. The body was but a vessel. What mattered was the soul. This belief filtered into daily life. A woman who washed too often was seen as vain. A man too interested in scent was suspicious. Vanity, indulgence, sensual pleasure, these were linked to the devil. Bathing could be a temptation, comfort a trap. Instead, the body was meant to be tamed, not pampered. To scrub it too clean might awaken desire. Better to keep it humble, hidden under wool, wrapped in discipline. But fear also ruled behavior. People feared water, not just because it was cold or scarce, but because it was believed to open the body to miasma, bad air, the invisible carrier of disease. Doctors of the time warned against excessive bathing. They believed that pores, once opened by heat, could let in pestilence. Better to sweat in silence than to risk the unseen dangers of a hot bath. The four humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, governed every diagnosis. Too much heat, too much moisture, an imbalance of bile, these were believed to cause illness. And so, water was used sparingly. Baths were prescribed only for certain temperaments. A melancholic man might be advised to bathe in warm milk. A choleric woman told to avoid steam. A sanguine child warned to stay dry. The body was a map of fluids, not bacteria. And so the treatment followed suit. Bloodletting was more common than washing. Leeches more trusted than soap. And illness, when it came, was often met not with cleaning, but with confession. Disease was punishment. Plague was divine wrath. A dirty body might not be the cause, but a sign of internal filth, greed, lust, pride. And so, penance replaced purification, pilgrimage instead of bathing, fasting instead of hygiene. Even childbirth, that most physical of acts, was wrapped in ritual. A woman in labor was considered impure. She was confined, veiled, her body hidden. After birth, she underwent churching, a ceremony to cleanse her spiritually before rejoining society. There was no sense of sterility. Midwives used bare hands. Instruments were wiped on cloth. The umbilical cord was cut with a knife used for food. The infant was swaddled in reused linen. And still, mothers gave birth, babies cried. Life went on. There were attempts, of course, to understand cleanliness. Herbal remedies flourished. Lavenders and sages were prized. People burned juniper to purify homes. Laurel was hung in doorways. Rue, considered protective, was rubbed on skin. Not all of it was superstition. Some plants truly had antiseptic properties, but their use was tangled with magic and myth. Boils were treated with spells, warts with toad saliva, wounds with spider webs and holy water. The boundary between medicine and miracle was thin. And then there were the plague years. Nothing exposed the limits of medieval hygiene like the Black Death. No amount of herbs, chants, or prayers could stop it. People fled cities, abandoned homes, burned their clothes. Doctors in beaked masks filled with aromatic herbs walked the streets. They poked victims with sticks. They avoided touch. They failed. The streets filled with corpses. The moats overflowed. And still, the connection between waste and illness remained blurry. People blamed the stars, the Jews, the air, the anger of God. Not the rats, not the fleas, not the filth beneath their feet. After the plague passed, some towns tried to change. Sanitation laws were rewritten. Butchers were moved. Wells were covered. Bathhouses reopened briefly. But the habits of centuries do not vanish overnight. The fear remained. The rituals endured. And so the stink returned. Through all this, there were moments of accidental hygiene. Knights polished their armor, not for cleanliness, but to prevent rust. Cooks scoured pots with sand, not to sanitize, but to remove grease. Washerwomen beat clothes on stones, not because they feared germs, but because it was their duty. And yet, these acts had unintended benefits. They slowed disease. They spared a few, but they were the exception, not the rule. Most lived in filth, and they lived with it. Children played in streets, slick with waste. Lovers met in shadows that stank of smoke and sweat. Priests offered blessings over coffins that had never known a clean bed. Hygiene, as we know it, did not exist. Only habit. Only hope. And so the medieval world moved forward, dirty, sacred, superstitious, surviving. They did not know how terrible their hygiene truly was. But we do, and we will continue soon. To understand the full extent of how medieval hygiene shaped daily life, we must step beyond castles and cathedrals and enter the tight alleyways, the open fields, the crowded cottages, and pestilent inns where the majority of people lived. Here, hygiene was not only an afterthought, it was a distant dream. Imagine a typical village at dawn. Chickens roam freely, their droppings mixing with the mud. Pigs snort in the ditches beside the road. Human waste is dumped from chamber pots directly onto the dirt pathways where barefoot children run and play. The air is heavy with the smells of rot, smoke, excrement, and stale beer. There is no concept of a garbage collection system, no sewage, no organized sanitation. What could not be burned was buried. What could not be buried was thrown into rivers. And the rivers, those arteries of medieval life, became cesspools. People drank from the same stream in which they washed their clothes, in which the butcher cleaned his knives, in which the tanner dumped chemicals used to soften hides. Fish floated belly up. The water turned black with filth. But it was all they had. Wells were few. Clean water, a luxury. Many drank weak ale daily, not for pleasure, but because fermentation made it safer than water. And so, the body began each day already steeped in compromise. In the home, things were not much better. Floors were made of packed dirt. Straw was spread across it to soak up spills and filth, and that straw was rarely changed. Lice, fleas, and mites lived within it. Dogs and livestock often shared the same sleeping space. A cow in the corner, chickens underfoot, the family in the middle. The fire smoked constantly, coating every surface with soot. Windows, if they existed, were small and unglazed. Curtains were seldom washed. Furniture was limited to a table, perhaps a bench, a chest, or a straw mattress. Beds were shared. Entire families, parents, grandparents, children slept together in the same frame, on the same mattress, wrapped in the same itchy woolen blankets. It was warm, but it was not clean. Linen sheets were a rarity. Pillows were stuffed with old rags or straw. There were no fitted sheets, no routine wash days. Bedding was changed when it was infested, not when it was dirty. And it was always dirty. Bed bugs were as common as dreams. When someone died, the mattress was aired and used again. Death did not erase need. Toilets were primitive. In the countryside, people used the fields, the woods, or buckets. In towns, privies were sometimes built wooden huts with holes above pits, but these pits filled quickly, they stank, they overflowed. And when they were emptied, it was by gong farmers, men who waded waist-deep into human waste, to shovel it out by hand, working only at night, ostracized by society, paid in coin and silence. The waste was carted away to the outskirts of town or dumped into rivers, and sometimes, when no one wanted the job, it simply stayed. The pit became the ground. In castles, the story wasn't much better. Lavish though they appeared, they too were plagued by the same limitations. Latrines, called garderobes, were holes built into walls that emptied into moats or cesspits. There was no flush, no water, just gravity. And the smell. Stone corridors carried it. It hung in tapestries and cloaks. Servants stuffed herbs into the crevices. Guests wrapped perfumed cloth over their noses, but nothing masked it entirely. Even royalty defecated in the cold, with no privacy but a curtain. And the toilet paper? There was none. Leaves, straw, rags, or nothing at all. The idea of wiping as we know it was unfamiliar. A clean posterior was not a priority. The residue remained, and clothing absorbed it. Underwear was rare. Breeches were shared. Wool chafed. Infections spread. And still, they endured. Women faced different challenges. Menstruation was barely discussed, let alone hygienically managed. There were no sanitary pads, no tampons. Rags were used, if available. Otherwise, women bled freely into their garments. Some fashioned crude belts to hold cloth in place. Others simply remained indoors during their time of the month. Menstruating women were seen as unclean, spiritually and physically. They were barred from church, from cooking, from touching sacred objects. There were no baths to ease the pain, no painkillers to dull the ache, just herbs and prayer. Childbirth was no cleaner. It took place at home, on a straw-covered floor, surrounded by female relatives and midwives. No antiseptics, no sterilized instruments, just instinct, experience, and hope. Bleeding, tearing, infection all common. Many women died. The ones who survived were considered blessed. Babies were swaddled immediately, tightly, their arms pinned. It was believed to help their limbs grow straight. In reality, it trapped sweat, filth, and urine against the skin. Diapering was minimal. Infants lay in their own waste. Rashes were common, cries constant. But life went on, because it had to. Hygiene or the lack of it was simply part of existence. It was not questioned. It was not analyzed. It just was. And through all this, the human spirit endured. Music was played, feasts were held. People laughed, told stories, danced in fields reeking of manure. The stars still shone, the rain still fell, and each morning they rose again to face the world dirty, aching, itching, but alive. That was medieval hygiene, and the worst is still to come. We continue soon. Now let us descend further into the lesser-known yet essential aspects of medieval hygiene, where culture, superstition, and class collided in strange and often repulsive ways. Because hygiene was not just a matter of dirt and disease, it was a mirror of one's place in the social order. The upper classes bathed slightly more often, not because they understood germs, but because they could afford heated water and servants to carry it. A noblewoman might sit in a wooden tub lined with cloth, surrounded by rose petals and scented oils, while her attendants poured warm water over her shoulders. But even this luxury was rare. Bathing was not a daily, or even weekly, habit. It was event-based, a preparation for marriage, a remedy after illness, a novelty when guests arrived. And as for the poor, water was often reserved for cooking or drinking, not cleaning. The peasantry scrubbed their hands and faces, perhaps before church. They might rinse their feet at the end of a long day in the fields, but full-body washing was a once-in-a-season ordeal. If a public bathhouse was nearby, it came with its own risks. Disease spread easily in shared tubs. Scabies, lice, and fungal infections thrived in warm, stagnant water. Towels were seldom clean. The wood soaked in filth. And yet people went, not always to cleanse, but to socialize, or in some cases, to find company in the shadows, as many bathhouses were linked to prostitution. Eventually, during times of plague, authorities shut them down entirely. Public bathing was seen as dangerous, sinful, or both, and so cleanliness was once again sacrificed to fear. But even among those who rarely washed, appearances mattered. Clothing was a symbol. A muddy tunic marked a man as lowborn. A fine cloak, regardless of smell, signaled wealth. And so people beat dust from their garments with sticks, rubbed them with chalk or ashes, brushed them with bundles of herbs. Wool was combed. Leather was scraped. But few had more than one outfit. A shirt was worn day and night until it rotted. Undergarments, if they existed, were patched over and over. Laundry was done in rivers, with lye made from ashes, or harsh soap that cracked the skin. And in winter, it froze stiff before it dried. Yet people carried on. They had no choice. Then there were the guilds. Professions that dealt directly with filth tanners, butchers, blacksmiths developed their own rituals of hygiene. A tanner worked daily with urine and animal hides. His hands were always stained, his clothes reeked of ammonia. But he might wash in vinegar to reduce the smell. A butcher might wear a blood-stained apron, but scrub his knives with salt. Blacksmiths burned their wounds closed. Bakers dusted their faces with flour. Each trade had its grime, each its own way of coping. And still, the distinction between filth and filthiness was philosophical. Dirt from the field was honest. Dirt from sin was dangerous. A man might be covered in mud and still be considered clean in the eyes of God, but a lustful glance, an idle hand, a whispered curse, these were the real stains. This was the teaching of the church, and so spiritual cleansing took precedence over physical. People fasted, confessed, whipped themselves during processions to appease God. They walked barefoot to shrines. They slept on stone floors. Not to be clean, but to be forgiven. In this environment, science struggled. Medicine was based on ancient texts, not observation. Galen and Hippocrates reigned supreme. A doctor might diagnose an imbalance of humors, prescribe a hot bath for melancholy or cold water for fever, but always with caution. Water was dangerous. Too much bathing made the skin porous, open to disease. Instead, physicians recommended dry cleaning with cloth, perfumes, and powders. Lavender sachets were worn around the neck, amulets against the plague, scented gloves. And everywhere, the odor lingered. Cities smelled like death. Paris, London, Prague, their names evoked grandeur, but their streets were filled with refuse. Human and animal waste mixed in the gutters. Rats scurried freely. Butchers dumped entrails in alleys. The stench of tanning, brewing, dyeing, each trade added to the chorus of smells. And yet people lived. They sang, they married, they prayed, they built cathedrals that reached toward heaven from streets that reeked of hell. The contradiction was not lost on them, but it was accepted, because it had to be. And through it all, the human body suffered. Skin diseases were rampant. Eczema, psoriasis, boils, abscesses, most went untreated. A wound might fester for weeks. A toothache might be solved with a blacksmith's pliers. Eyes clouded, lungs wheezed, and when the body broke down, it was often buried quickly. Graves were shallow. The dead decomposed in soil already crowded. In some places, bones were dug up to make space. Ossuaries were built. Skulls stacked beside femurs. The air in churchyards was thick with rot. But no one thought to change the system. No one thought that cleanliness could save lives. Not yet. That idea was centuries away. For now, they endured. Because endurance was the only cleanliness they could afford. And still, the worst was not over. There is more filth to explore. And we will, soon. To fully understand the horrors and realities of medieval hygiene, we must turn our gaze now to the institutions that governed, educated, and treated the people. Because it was not just the peasants who were immersed in filth monasteries, universities, and hospitals. Were also breeding grounds for disease, disorder, and decay. Let us begin with the hospitals. These were not places of healing as we understand them today, but rather institutions of piety and charity. Their main function was not to cure, but to care, to offer shelter, food, and prayer to the sick and dying. And within these walls, sanitation was crude at best. The sick lay in long shared halls, sometimes dozens, to a room. Their cots packed tightly, with only a thin blanket, and perhaps a wooden bowl of broth to sustain them. The air was thick with the scent of open sores, urine, sweat, and damp straw. Windows were few. Ventilation was poor. And although nuns and monks tended to the ill with devotion, they did so without knowledge of germs or contagion. Instruments were not sterilized. Wounds were wrapped with reused cloth. Leeches were applied again and again. Pus was seen as a sign of healing. Bloodletting was a daily ritual. And when one patient died, their bed was often quickly filled with another, without so much as a fresh sheet. Floors were swept with wet rags. Water was fetched from nearby wells or rivers, often polluted. Chamber pots were emptied infrequently. Flies buzzed in corners. Rats scurried beneath beds. And amidst all this, people prayed. They lit candles. They sang hymns. They begged for salvation. Because if the body could not be saved, perhaps the soul still could. Now consider the universities. Centers of learning, yes, but not of cleanliness. Young men came to study theology, law, and medicine, but they lived in cramped quarters, shared rooms, and seldom bathed. Lectures were held in drafty halls where the stink of unwashed bodies mingled with the ink of manuscripts and the sweat of nervous scholars. Latrines, if present, were rarely maintained. Food was simple: bread, cheese, weak ale, and sometimes spoiled meat. Hands were wiped on cloaks. Hair was never cut short. Beards were unkempt. And lice were considered a natural part of the academic life. Debate was fierce. Hygiene was not. Monasteries, too, provide a sobering example. While monks often adhered to stricter rules of order and ritual washing, these acts were symbolic more than hygienic. They washed hands before meals, feet on holy days, and faces before prayer, but full-body bathing was rare, especially in winter. Cloisters echoed with the murmurs of psalms and the soft patter of bare feet on cold stone. But behind the silence, the smells told a different story. Communal latrines emptied into pits or streams. Robes were worn until threadbare. Straw mattresses were never changed. Pilgrims came and went, bringing news and vermin in equal measure. Sacred relics were touched by hundreds of hands, never cleaned. And still, this was considered a place of purity, because the soul was washed, even if the skin was not. Across the countryside, inns and taverns offered no reprieve. Travelers slept in shared beds, often with strangers. Blankets were full of lice. Sheets, if they existed, had not been washed in months. There were no soaps, no towels, no water for cleaning. A traveler might arrive after days on muddy roads, sit beside a roaring fire to warm his bones, but never once remove his boots or rinse his face. Food was eaten with bare, dirty hands. Cups were shared. Plates wiped with bread or sleeve. And at night, the air was filled with snores, coughs, and the scratching of fleas. On feast days, hygiene grew worse. Markets swelled with crowds. Food spoiled quickly in the sun. Butchers hacked meat on wooden blocks stained black with old blood. Flies landed freely. Ale spilled. Dogs licked scraps from the ground. Drunken revelers relieved themselves in alleys. Children played nearby. And above it all, the church bells rang. They called the people to prayer, to penance, to give thanks. Because this was life. Messy, loud, sacred, filthy. Women had their own burdens still. In the absence of feminine hygiene products, childbirth was a harrowing ordeal. Midwives reused tools. Cord was cut with rusty blades. Newborns were swaddled in soiled cloth. There were no antiseptics, no clean water, no understanding of postpartum infections. Many mothers died of childbed fever, others suffered in silence. And the babies who lived were often wrapped too tightly, fed from unclean vessels, and rocked to sleep in cradles lined with rags. Superstition ruled the sick. People believed disease came from miasmas, from foul air, from sin, from stars misaligned. They carried pomanders of herbs, burnt incense, rang bells to ward off plague. But they did not clean their homes. They did not boil their water. They did not wash their hands, because they did not know. And when they died with hope not of medicine but of mercy, that their pain had meaning, that their suffering was seen, that the next world would be clean. And so, through it all, they endured. They built kingdoms on rotting foundations. They wrote poetry while covered in grime. They composed music in moldy abbeys. They invented stories that still live today. And though their skin cracked and their teeth fell out and their bodies failed them, their spirits somehow did not. This was the real medieval world, not just swords and banners, but filth and survival. And that, more than anything, is what makes their story unforgettable. Sleep now, with that in mind. Let us now walk through the winding alleys of medieval cities, their walls leaning in close, casting long shadows over cobblestone paths worn smooth by centuries of feet. These places were not just dirty, they were designed to be. The cities of the Middle Ages were cramped, chaotic, and soaked in centuries of filth. Streets were narrow and dark, clogged with carts, animals, and pedestrians. Horses defecated where they stood. Dogs rooted through garbage. Pigs ran wild, feasting on refuse. Every morning, residents emptied chamber pots from second-story windows, letting them splash into the gutters below. It was not uncommon to hear someone shout, "Gardaloo!" a warning that waste was about to fall from the sky. People ducked. Sometimes they didn't. And so, the streets became rivers of decay. Open sewers, known as kennels, ran along the middle of the road. These were shallow trenches meant to carry away waste, but they often clogged with straw, bones, and cloth. During rains, they overflowed. In dry spells, they stank. Children played beside them. Merchants set up stalls nearby. Bread was sold mere feet from manure, and the smell was never gone. It clung to hair, to clothing, to every breath. Public sanitation was a dream still unborn. There were no garbage trucks, no sewage treatment. Instead, waste was shoveled by hand, sometimes carted outside the city walls, more often left to rot. Rats were everywhere, fat and bold, darting between shadows, nesting in woodpiles and basements, spreading fleas with every step. And yet people endured, because this was home. Even the grandest cathedrals were not immune. Pilgrims came from distant lands, hundreds or thousands at a time, sleeping on floors, relieving themselves behind walls, washing only in holy fountains. Relics were touched by unwashed hands. Icons were kissed by mouths full of rot. In winter, the smell was stifled by cold. In summer, it grew unbearable. And still, the bells rang. Still, the candles burned. Still, the choirs sang. Because faith did not need to be clean. It only needed to be constant. Water sources were a different problem altogether. Wells were shallow. Rivers ran through towns, carrying human and animal waste in equal measure. The same stream that quenched thirst was used for laundry, for bathing, for dumping blood from the butcher's block. Brewing beer became common not just for taste, but for safety. Boiled water was less likely to kill. And so even children drank ale. The idea of boiling drinking water was not yet widespread. Illness was blamed on bad air, on sin, on divine punishment, not on the cup in your hand. Privies, when they existed, were basic. A hole in a board, a seat over a pit, wooden, damp, crawling with insects. In castles, waste was sometimes directed into moats, yes. Those romantic waters that surrounded stone walls were often filled with sewage. The rich were not exempt from stench. They simply masked it with perfumes, with flowers, with ornate clothing that absorbed the filth more elegantly. Fragrance was a mark of wealth, but it did not mean one was clean. And when the Black Death arrived, it did not discriminate. It moved through slums and manors, through markets and monasteries. It fed on the filth. Corpses piled in the streets. Mass graves opened like wounds. Priests carried incense to mask the rot. Doctors wore beaked masks stuffed with herbs, not to protect from disease, but from smell. The world became a charnel house, and still people clung to life. They washed with vinegar. They burned herbs. They prayed harder. They fled cities, only to find death waiting in the countryside. And when the plague finally receded, nothing had changed. The waste still flowed. The rats still scurried. The people still lived in filth, because filth was the fabric of their lives. It was all they had ever known, and no one, not yet, had the courage or the knowledge to say it could be different, that the world could be clean, that a child could grow without lice, that a mother could birth without fever, that death could come gently, not through a boil or a cough or a scream. But that time would come, not in this century, not in the next, but one day. For now, we walk these streets in memory. We smell the smoke, the sweat, the refuse. We hear the clang of metal, the cry of the hawker, the mutter of the priest. And we remember not to romanticize, but to understand. This was life, once, and it was terrible. And it was beautiful, and it was real. Let us shift our focus now to the curious paradox of the medieval bathhouse, a place that, in theory, should have represented relief, cleansing, and reprieve from the overwhelming filth of everyday life, but instead became yet another emblem of the complicated, contradictory relationship medieval people had with hygiene. In early medieval Europe, public bathhouses had been inherited from Roman traditions. These were places where communities gathered not just to wash, but to socialize, to gossip, to conduct business. Large stone buildings with heated water, hot steam rooms, and attendants who offered scrubbing or massage. Some bathhouses even offered meals, music, and entertainment. On paper, it seemed civilized, but reality was far more murky. The water was often recycled, the pools were seldom drained. Dozens bathed in the same tub. Skin cells, sweat, oil, and filth swirled together in a tepid broth. There was no soap as we know it, no disinfectant, no chlorine. And as bathhouses grew popular, they also gained a reputation for immorality. Many were attached to brothels or operated unofficially as such. Men and women bathed together. Curtains separated massage areas. And eventually, authorities began to shut them down not because they were unclean, but because they were seen as sinful. Hygiene once again lost to moral panic. In rural areas, people turned to rivers and ponds. But even here, problems arose. Bathing in public waters was dangerous. The water was often polluted with animal runoff, household waste, and human excrement. Parasites thrived. Leeches waded in the shallows, and without towels or proper clothes for drying, bathers often caught cold. This led to a growing belief that bathing, especially full-body bathing, was itself harmful. That opening one's pores made the body vulnerable to disease. That dirt, in some strange way, acted as a protective barrier. And so, as the centuries wore on, people bathed less. The nobility might wash their hands and faces with rosewater, but rarely stripped fully. Linen underclothes were changed more often than the body was washed. The idea was that fresh fabric could absorb the sweat and oils from the skin. Change the shirt, don't cleanse the person. And perfumes were layered over the rest. Musk, ambergris, and floral tinctures masked the odor but did not remove its cause. Barbers played a unique role in this strange hygiene landscape. They were surgeons, tooth pullers, and hair cutters. A man might sit for a shave and have a boil lanced in the same session. Bloodletting was performed as a form of cleansing, removing bad humors from the body. But the instruments were reused. Razors scraped infected skin and moved on to the next client. There were no gloves, no antiseptics, only trust and habit. In monasteries, where order and ritual ruled, some cleanliness persisted. Monks washed before meals. They trimmed hair, maintained latrines, and laundered robes. But even these bastions of discipline had limits. Water was fetched in buckets. Fires were expensive to maintain. Cold baths were the norm. And in winter, the act of bathing could be deadly. To avoid illness, many simply abstained. Pilgrimages offered another glimpse into the medieval body in motion. Pilgrims walked hundreds of miles, slept in barns, fields, and crowded inns. Their feet were blistered, their robes caked in dust. They rarely bathed on the journey. And when they arrived at shrines or holy relics, they were not greeted with soap and water, but with incense, candles, and prayer. The idea of spiritual cleansing always eclipsed the physical. Even childbirth followed this paradox. After delivering a child, a woman was considered ritually unclean and required a churching ceremony, a kind of spiritual purification. But little was done to cleanse the body. Midwives wiped with rags, cord was cut with dull knives, blood was left to dry. Women lay in their birthing beds for days, recovering in sweat-soaked linens. And when fever came, it came without mercy. In noble households, hygiene became a matter of performance. A lady might have a silver basin and scented oils. Servants would bring warmed water and ewers. Hair would be combed and braided. Hands would be washed before meals. But these gestures were more symbolic than thorough. A rinse, not a scrub. A veil of civility over an unchanged reality. And as castles grew more elaborate, with tapestries and carpets and feather beds, the problem only grew worse. These luxuries trapped dust, lice, and moisture, and beneath the layers of velvet and fur, bodies still festered. The illusion of cleanliness did not make it so. In the streets, the situation was unchanged. The same chamber pots, the same gutters, the same dogs rooting through waste. And yet people lived, laughed, loved, and endured. Because the human spirit is not so easily conquered by filth. They married, they danced, they sang. They painted their saints and carved their gargoyles and built their world atop a foundation of grime. And perhaps that is what makes their story most remarkable. Not that they were clean, but that they were resilient. That they did not know what we know, yet they survived. That in the stink of life, they found joy. And that in the darkness, they lit candles, one by one. To understand how medieval hygiene deteriorated and fluctuated over time, we must walk slowly, century by century, through the long and winding corridors of European history. In doing so, we see not a linear decline or ascent, but a pendulum swinging between knowledge and fear, wealth and want, ritual and reason. Around the 5th century, with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, public infrastructure began to crumble. Roman baths, aqueducts, and sewage systems that once provided structured hygiene collapsed alongside the empire that had built them. Cities shrank. Roads fell into disrepair. The idea of organized sanitation became a memory. Hygiene became local rivers and wells, dirt floors and chamber pots. It was no longer a matter of public concern, but of household necessity. By the 6th and 7th centuries, bathing became associated more with monastic discipline than public life. Monasteries maintained ritual washing before meals and prayers, and monks bathed several times a year on holy days or for penance. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the early 6th century, emphasized moderation. Cleanliness was encouraged, but bathing was not excessive. Meanwhile, common folk had fewer resources. They relied on streams, rainfall, and cold basins. The 8th and 9th centuries, under the Carolingian dynasty, saw a modest revival of order. Charlemagne himself was known to bathe regularly, and his court encouraged grooming. He ordered the construction of baths and required his servants to keep themselves tidy. But these were exceptions. For most of Europe, the peasantry remained steeped in mud, labor, and survival. Cleanliness was a luxury. In the 10th and 11th centuries, as towns began to re-emerge and populations grew, so too did concerns about space and waste. Cities like London, Paris, and Cologne began to swell, but they lacked the planning or resources of ancient Rome. Houses were packed tightly. Livestock roamed freely. Human waste piled in alleys. Latrines were basic pits or wooden seats above rivers. Some homes had none at all. In the 12th century, public bathhouses returned in force, inspired partly by Islamic cities where cleanliness was part of religious life. Crusaders, returning from the Middle East, brought tales of tiled baths and scented waters. In cities like Bologna, Nuremberg, and Paris, bathhouses opened near marketplaces and bridges. These were shared, unsegregated, and increasingly popular. But by the 13th century, these places became entwined with moral suspicion. Bathing houses became known not just for washing, but for lewd behavior. Prostitution often operated under the cover of cleanliness. Church authorities began to speak against them. Some were shuttered. Others were taxed. Bathing, once again, became suspect. During the 14th century, the arrival of the Black Death changed everything. As the plague swept through Europe from 1347 to 1351, killing nearly a third of the population, the idea of cleanliness shifted from aesthetic to existential. Many believed that water opened the pores and allowed miasmas, bad airs to enter the body. Bathing was avoided. Bodies went unwashed. Clothing was rarely changed. Perfumes and dried herbs were carried to protect against the invisible. People wore garlic, vinegar-soaked sponges, or aromatic pouches. Physicians in long-beaked masks walked the streets. Hygiene regressed under the weight of fear. In the 15th century, superstition ruled. The idea of cleanliness took on religious overtones. Cleanliness of the soul was prized above that of the skin. Washing became ritualized, especially in noble courts, where scented hand-washing before meals was seen as piety and refinement. But full-body washing remained rare. Many believed that visible dirt was preferable to the unseen dangers of open pores. In royal courts, elaborate clothes covered unwashed flesh. Lice combs and scented oils were more common than soap. Soap, by the way, had existed in various forms since antiquity, but it was harsh, made with animal fat and lye, and considered unpleasant. Only the wealthy could afford better formulations with olive oil or herbs. In the early 16th century, some changes began to stir. Humanist thinkers began to question old beliefs. Medical texts were copied and circulated. Ideas from the Islamic world and classical antiquity resurfaced. Some physicians began to recommend moderate bathing, but the infrastructure was still lacking. Clean water remained scarce. Privies still emptied into moats or streets. And for the average villager, bathing remained a seasonal or symbolic affair. In winter, it was dangerous. In summer, it was fleeting. And so the medieval era closed as it had begun, in a haze of sweat, smoke, and soil. The Renaissance would later usher in new ideas, but for now, the age of knights and castles, peasants and plagues, marched on under layers of wool, leather, and filth. Through this slow march of time, hygiene was not just a matter of cleanliness. It was a reflection of belief, of fear, of culture. It told people who they were, what they feared, what they valued. And as each century passed, the story did not improve in a straight line. It curved and twisted, as human stories always do. And perhaps the most important truth of all is this: they did the best they could, with what little they knew, in a world that was far more complex and far more terrible than we often remember. To explore the worst aspects of medieval hygiene, we must descend into the spaces people preferred not to think about: the dark corners beneath floorboards, the alleys behind taverns, the foul-smelling trenches at the edge of every village. We begin, perhaps inevitably, with the cesspits. Beneath castles, monasteries, and even more modest homes, people dug deep holes into the earth to serve as receptacles for human waste. These cesspits were unlined, they leaked. The soil became saturated. And when they filled, they had to be emptied not by machines or hoses, but by men known as gong farmers. The gong farmer was among the most reviled professions in medieval society. Working by moonlight to avoid the stench in the daytime heat, they descended into the pits with shovels and buckets, scraping the accumulated waste by hand. Their skin blistered. The fumes sickened them. And yet they were essential. Without them, the waste would rise. And sometimes it did. During wet seasons, when ground levels rose, the filth would flood cellars. Rats multiplied, flies swarmed, disease spread. Latrines in castles were little better. Known as garderobes, they were narrow shafts built into the outer walls. A seat with a hole opened directly onto the moat or courtyard below. Some had chutes that led to pits or flowing water. Others simply dropped their contents onto the stones beneath. The stench was ever present. In warm weather, it became unbearable. Servants scattered herbs on the floors. Tapestries absorbed the smell. In manors and taverns, the toilet might be a wooden bench over a bucket, or nothing at all. Travelers relieved themselves by the roadside. City streets were fouled by both humans and animals. In London, ordinances were passed again and again to prevent people from throwing waste out their windows, yet the practice persisted. Chamber pots were emptied into the gutters. In some towns, cries of "Garde low" warned passers-by to step aside before contents were flung down. But many didn't listen or didn't care. Rain washed it all toward the nearest river. And there, at the banks, children played. Women washed clothes. People drew drinking water. In the countryside, barns became privies. Hay soaked in waste. Livestock stood in their own filth. Farmers wiped hands on aprons stained with manure. Midwives delivered babies in kitchens, chickens roosted in rafters, and barefoot children ran through mud that was more than mud. Bed linens were rarely changed. Mattresses stuffed with straw absorbed sweat, urine, and blood. They were seldom aired. Fleas nested deep within them, and those fleas, small, silent, deadly, brought the plague. Lice were considered inevitable. Combs removed some, but not all. Boils were lanced with shared knives. Bandages were reused. Pus and blood were wiped with rags and thrown into the hearth. Toothaches were endured. Teeth were pulled with pliers. Gums became infected. Mouths festered. Halitosis was rampant. There were new toothbrushes, new dental floss, new antiseptic rinses. People chewed herbs or rubbed ash on their teeth. It masked the rot, but did not stop it. And when pain became too much, they drank ale, wine, mead, anything to dull the agony. The kitchen, the supposed heart of the home, was no sanctuary. Food was stored in barrels, but rats chewed through the wood. Insects bred in flour and grain. Meat was salted, dried, or smoked, but often still spoiled. Milk soured quickly. Cheese was hard and moldy. Bread was dense, dark, often contaminated with ergot. Ergotism, a form of poisoning, caused convulsions and hallucinations. People thought it was witchcraft. It was mold. Water was worse. Wells were near latrines. Springs ran through manure fields. Rain mixed with filth from thatched roofs. Most people drank weak ale or diluted wine because it was safer. And yet even this safety was illusion. Fermentation killed some bacteria, but not all, and no one knew about germs. They blamed bad air, angry spirits, or divine punishment. Women wore layers of fabric to protect their skin from filth. But that fabric trapped moisture, rashes formed, sores festered. Children were swaddled for months, their bodies never fully washed. Cradle cap, skin infections, and lice were common. Elders, when they could no longer tend to their own needs, were left to lie in their waste, and even in death, hygiene failed. Corpses were buried shallow, unembalmed, sometimes wrapped in a shroud, sometimes not. During plague years, they were stacked in pits, doused in lime, and quickly covered. Dogs dug them up. The air turned sweet and rancid. All of this was not the product of laziness. It was ignorance, a lack of tools, a world without bleach, running water, or antibiotics. They fought to survive in it the best they could. They endured. But the truth remains, medieval hygiene was not just terrible, it was horrific. And in every thatched roof, every stone floor, every pile of straw, the smell of life lingered, pungent, persistent, and utterly human. If the cesspits and chamber pots told the story of what left the human body, then the tools and methods of the medieval world tell the tale of what clung to it, what remained on the skin, in the hair, and beneath the fingernails. One of the greatest myths about the Middle Ages is that people never washed. The truth is more nuanced. They did wash, but not as we imagine. There were no daily showers, no soap with moisturizing oils, no warm tiled bathrooms where steam curled upwards. Instead, there were basins of cold water, cloths for wiping, and a belief that dry rubbing with linen could cleanse as well as water. The poorest of the poor had no towels, no basins, not even soap. A corner of a cloak might serve as a rag. Rain was a blessing, not just for the fields, but for the skin. Children stood beneath the gutters when storms came. Adults cupped their hands to gather the runoff. Rivers were used for everything: bathing, washing clothes, watering livestock, dumping refuse. A woman might kneel at the bank, scrubbing tunics with lye, while upstream a butcher rinsed blood from his knives. Downstream, a tanner poured lime and urine into the flow. In this soup of needs, hygiene was always a compromise. Soap, such as it was, came in hard, yellowish blocks. It was made from animal fat boiled with ash or lye, harsh and drying. The rich imported Castile soap, smoother, whiter, scented. But for most, the soap stung the skin and left hands cracked. Even nobles used it sparingly. Many relied on scented waters, rose or lavender infused, to mask the body's scent rather than cleanse it. Perfume was not a luxury, it was a shield. Clothing was washed less often than bodies. Wool was difficult to clean. Linen wore thin. Most garments were brushed, shaken out, and aired in the sun. Stains were accepted. Smell was endured. A nobleman might own 3 or 4 complete outfits. A peasant, perhaps only 1. Layers were added in winter, never washed, just reworn until spring. Hair was brushed daily but seldom washed. Combs were prized possessions, often carved from wood or bone, and they were used both for grooming and for delousing. Fleas and lice were constant companions. They crawled across scalps, burrowed into seams, and nestled in bedding. Boiling clothes could kill them, but firewood was scarce, and water had to be drawn by hand. Head coverings, hats, veils, coifs served both fashion and function. They kept hair contained, concealed oiliness, and offered some protection from vermin. For women, long hair was bound tightly, sometimes wrapped in cloth. For men, shorter styles were easier to maintain, but dandruff and nits still prevailed. The hands, used for everything from eating to fieldwork, were often filthy. Soap was rare. Water was colder than comfort allowed. Some wiped hands on grass. Others used sand to scrub away grease. In wealthier homes, a basin was brought before meals, and guests rinsed fingers in scented water while servants held the bowl. Fingernails were trimmed with knives, bitten, or ignored. Feet fared even worse. Boots were seldom removed. Socks were a luxury. Skin blistered, cracked, and festered. Fungus grew. Toenails thickened. And yet, shoes were repaired, not discarded. Leather was patched, soles restitched. The foot endured. Teeth, too, were a quiet battlefield. There were no dentists, no toothpaste, no floss. People chewed sticks, rinsed with wine, or rubbed salt and ash on their gums. Cures for toothache included burning herbs near the ear, stuffing garlic into the cavity, or simply pulling the offending tooth with pliers. Gums bled, breath stank, mouths became graveyards of rot. And yet people smiled. They sang, they kissed. Public bathhouses offered temporary respite, especially in towns and cities. But these were communal, often mixed sex, and not always safe. They were centers of gossip, vice, and disease. Still, the promise of warm water was enough to draw the masses. A weekly bath, if affordable, became a ritual. Bathing clothes were optional. Buckets of hot water were poured into tubs. Herbs might be added: rosemary, sage, chamomile. But the water was seldom changed. One bather followed another. Children splashed beside merchants. Prostitutes sat near pilgrims. It was both intimate and impersonal. Over time, fear replaced comfort. The spread of disease, especially during plague years, caused many to abandon bathing altogether. They believed water opened the pores, making the body vulnerable to the bad airs of illness. Dry rubbing with cloth became the norm. People perfumed themselves instead of washing. Linen underclothes were changed, not for cleanliness, but for status. A fresh tunic showed wealth. A clean handkerchief meant influence. But the body beneath was still the same: sweating, itching, enduring. Personal hygiene became an act of adaptation. People adapted to smells, to parasites, to the limitations of their world. They accepted what we would find intolerable. They found dignity where we see filth. They lived in layers of wool, of dirt, of centuries. And somehow, in all of it, they persisted. With cracked hands, aching backs, and unwashed skin, they plowed the fields, raised their children, and told their stories. Their hygiene was terrible, but their humanity was not. The question of medieval hygiene cannot be fully understood without stepping inside the institutions meant to serve both body and soul. Monasteries, though often seen as clean and orderly, were paradoxical when it came to cleanliness. Monks lived under strict rules: ritual hand-washing before meals, purification through water before prayer, symbolic cleansing of the body, but these rituals did not equate to sanitation in the modern sense. Monasteries sometimes had running water systems, aqueducts that carried fresh spring water into the cloisters, even channels that carried waste away from latrines. But in practice, the water stagnated, pipes clogged, debris gathered. Frogs and insects bred in the channels. And when the plague came, It entered through those same open channels. Hospitals, too, were not as we imagine them. In medieval Europe, hospitals were not primarily places of healing, they were places of care, rest, and often death. Nuns changed linens when they could, but straw pallets were reused again and again. The air was heavy with rot and incense, the smell of decay masked only slightly by sacred smoke. Pus was not cleaned so much as wiped away with cloth that was then rinsed and reused. The idea of sterilization did not exist. Wounds were dressed with honey, with wine, with vinegar, sometimes helpful, sometimes not. Surgery was done with bare hands. Instruments were boiled if time allowed, wiped if it didn't. The barber-surgeon was both hair cutter and healer, pulling teeth, lancing boils, amputating limbs, and cutting hair all in the same space, sometimes without washing in between. The plague years brought a heightened awareness of filth, but not a true understanding. People saw the connection between dirt and death, but misinterpreted the cause. They wore amulets, burned herbs, carried nosegays bouquets of sweet-smelling plants to ward off the miasma. The bad air they believed brought disease. Cities passed laws, streets had to be swept. Butchers were fined for spilling blood. Leather tanners were pushed to the outskirts, but enforcement was rare. The gutters still ran black. The air still choked with smoke and rot. The church taught that physical filth could be forgiven by spiritual cleanliness. Pilgrims walked barefoot for weeks, never washing, believing their suffering purified the soul. Flagellants whipped themselves bloody, crying out to heaven, covered in sweat and dust, believing pain would save the world. Bathing at times was seen as a vanity, a sin of the flesh. Warm water stirred desire, and desire was dangerous. In winter, no one bathed. The water froze. Fires were reserved for food and survival. In spring, the ritual bath returned one, maybe two, a year. Whole families used the same water, starting with the father, then the mother, then the children, then the baby. By the end, the water was cold and black. This is where the saying, "Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater," found its origin. In castles, servants heated water by the bucket. A copper tub was placed near the hearth. Nobles bathed with perfumed soap and silk cloths. But the stone floors beneath held centuries of grime. Rats lived in the walls. Mice chewed through sacks of grain. Cats were both companion and pest control. Dogs wandered freely indoors, muddy-pawed and flea-ridden. Bedbugs lived in the seams of feather mattresses. Spiders wove webs in rafters. Cleanliness was fleeting. In cities like Paris, London, Prague, and Florence, waste was constant and management inadequate. Manure from horses, offal from markets, urine from chamber pots, it all flowed into the same narrow streets. In summer, the stench was overwhelming. People stuffed herbs into their nostrils just to walk to church. Doctors wore beaked masks filled with aromatic substances, but the air betrayed them all. Children played barefoot in it. Lovers kissed beside it. Food was sold next to it, and no one escaped it. Not even kings. Edward III of England, for all his power, complained bitterly about the stench of the Thames. French kings built pleasure palaces beside latrine-stinking rivers. Royalty walked through the same filth as commoners. Disease knew no status. Some tried to resist. Herbal remedies were brewed to cleanse the blood. Baths were taken under moonlight, believed to be safer than sunlit soaks. Astrology-guided hygiene: don't cut your nails on a waning moon. Don't wash your head on Saint's Day. But none of it worked. People still died of infections, fevers, stomach ailments. Babies still died in cradles never cleaned. Soldiers died with wounds festering under crusted bandages. And women died in childbirth, surrounded by unwashed hands. Yet amid all of this, life continued. They did not collapse under their filth. They found joy despite the odor. Songs were sung. Laughter echoed. Markets bustled. Lovers embraced. They survived not because they were clean, but because they were resilient. The human spirit, even when clothed in dirt, burned bright. And perhaps that is the final truth of medieval hygiene. Not that it was terrible, which it was, but that humanity persisted in spite of it. To fully understand why medieval hygiene was so dreadful, one must also understand the deeper beliefs that shaped it: the culture, the religion, the science, as they knew it. Hygiene was not just a physical act, but a spiritual, medical, and social one. The medieval mind viewed the body not as a machine to be maintained, but as a vessel for the soul, something to be endured, disciplined, and at times even denied. Cleanliness was often seen as suspicious if taken too far. A perfectly clean body could be interpreted as vanity, and vanity was sin. Monks and nuns practiced abstinence not just from pleasures of the flesh, but from the care of the flesh. Filth became a mark of humility. Some saints were said to have never washed, believing that their suffering brought them closer to God. The notion of mortification of the flesh extended to hygiene. A stinking body was evidence of spiritual purity. To the devout, cleanliness of the soul was far more urgent than the stench of the skin. Physicians, meanwhile, believed in the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health depended on balance. Bathing could disrupt this. If one became too warm, too wet, too exposed, it could trigger an imbalance. Water opened the pores, it was said, making the body vulnerable to bad air. This belief was not fringe. It was medical consensus. Doctors advised their patients to avoid bathing during epidemics. Instead, they recommended dry rubs with cloths, gentle scraping of the skin, or the wearing of fragrant herbs sewn into garments. The idea of contagion, though dimly understood, was often interpreted through the lens of smell. Foul odors were not just offensive, they were dangerous. If a place smelled bad, it was believed to cause illness. This is why people carried pomanders, small, perforated containers filled with spices and flowers on chains around their necks. It's why homes were fumigated with burning rosemary. It's why so many feared the bathhouse when plague came. The relationship between the church and hygiene was also complex. On the one hand, the church had rituals that encouraged washing, cleansing before communion, washing the feet of the poor, and symbolic ablutions. On the other hand, excessive bathing was frowned upon, associated with sexual temptation and indulgence. In early medieval times, public bathhouses were even attached to monasteries, offering a place for pilgrims and paupers to clean themselves. But by the later Middle Ages, many of these were closed, blamed for encouraging immoral behavior. And so, what began as charity became scandal. There was also a gendered component to cleanliness. Women were seen as both more impure and more responsible for cleanliness. Menstrual blood was feared and misunderstood. Women were expected to manage their unclean bodies discreetly, often with cloths, herbs, and silence. Midwives, the guardians of women's health, passed down their knowledge orally, in kitchens and birth rooms, never in books. Their wisdom was practical: how to ease a fever, how to clean after birth, how to wash an infant with warm wine and linen. But because they were women, and because their knowledge came without Latin or license, they were often distrusted. Some were even accused of witchcraft for knowing too much. The irony is that their practices were often more hygienic than those of the male physicians who followed them. In cities, guilds began to regulate certain trades that affected public hygiene: tanners, butchers, waste collectors. Rules were written: throw waste only at night, sweep your stall, keep your tools clean. But rules are not always followed. Enforcement was lax, corruption was rampant. The city watch could be bribed. The fines were small. And so the meat market still stank of entrails. The tanner's quarters still reeked of urine. The alleys still ran with slurry. Nightmen, those who emptied latrines and cesspits, worked in darkness. They were essential and reviled, invisible and vital. Their work kept the streets passable, yet their presence was a reminder of what society wanted to ignore. They were not thanked. They were paid poorly. They died young. Their stories are not carved in stone. Yet they were the front line of medieval sanitation. In the countryside, peasants lived closer to the earth and to its dirt. Their hygiene rituals were tied to the seasons. Spring meant water from melted snow, a chance to scrub clothes against rocks. Summer meant bathing in rivers when no one watched. Autumn was for collecting herbs that masked odor: thyme, mint, lavender. Winter, survival. Washing was rare, water frozen, skin wrapped in layers. Yet among the poor, there was a surprising resilience. They knew which plants soothed rashes, how to boil water when they could, how to sweep a floor with bundled twigs. They did not have perfume, but they had ash. They did not have medicine, but they had garlic. They endured. And in castles among the nobility, hygiene was both ostentatious and insufficient. Queens perfumed their hair, but slept in vermin-filled beds. Kings wore fur-lined robes, but rarely changed their undergarments. Servants brushed their masters' clothes, but their own remained caked in soot. Luxury coexisted with squalor. Beauty masked decay. And through it all, people lived. They kissed their children, broke bread with neighbors, offered prayers with calloused hands. They built cathedrals with filthy fingers. They composed poetry while itching from lice. They dreamed of heaven while standing ankle-deep in mud. Because to them, hygiene was not a standard. It was a spectrum. It was what one could manage. It was what dignity remained after the last washwater cooled. To peer deeper into the heart of medieval hygiene is to confront a world where beliefs, scarcity, and adaptation intertwined. Hygiene was not simply a forgotten habit. It was a practice reshaped by limitations, rituals, and the rhythms of survival. In the absence of soap as we know it, people relied on substitutes made from ash and animal fat, mixed into rough lye that could sting the skin. Laundry was not done with detergent, but with urine. Yes, human urine, left to ferment in clay jars until it turned into ammonia-rich liquid that could bleach linen and clean wool. Washerwomen, who bore the brunt of this labor, gathered clothes at the edge of streams. Their hands reddened and cracked from constant scrubbing and wringing. They sang as they worked, a rhythm born not from joy but from necessity. Their world was water, weight, and weather. Rain could flood their efforts. Drought could dry the rivers. And all the while, they stood ankle-deep in currents that carried more than dirt downstream. Personal hygiene was often confined to gestures. Wiping one's hands on cloth after eating, combing lice from hair with bone or wooden combs, picking at teeth with sticks or threads. Mouths rarely knew mint or freshness. Tooth powders were made of crushed eggshell, charcoal, or sage, if used at all. Breath was sour, gums bled, cavities festered. But smiling was rare, and mirrors rarer still. People didn't mind as much what they could not see, and they certainly did not judge themselves against the gleam of glass or glamour of modern standards. Hygiene was also political. Kings issued proclamations about sanitation in cities not out of compassion, but to preserve order, prevent riots, and protect trade. Filth, after all, could become rebellion. If too many corpses lined the alleys, if too many beggars moaned with open sores, it reflected poorly on a ruler, so cesspits were covered. Corpses were buried. Wells were inspected, but only when complaints grew too loud. The rest of the time, the smell of decay was background noise, as normal as church bells. In times of war, hygiene plummeted even further. Soldiers marched in armor that trapped sweat, dirt, and blood. Wounds went untreated. Latrines overflowed or were dug hastily in shallow pits. Fleas traveled from camp to camp, bearing plague. And lice were constant companions. Helmets hid crawling infestations. Tunics itched with vermin. Men scratched until they bled. It was not uncommon for knights to wear the same underpadding for weeks, even months. The inside of chainmail was as foul as any stable. And yet they fought, shouted, lived, and died. In sieges, hygiene broke completely. Cities turned inward. Water ran low. Food spoiled. Waste gathered. The air turned toxic. Disease erupted behind the walls as fast as arrows struck them from without. For every death by sword, 2 more came from sickness. And still, people endured. In peacetime, cleanliness became a matter of class. Nobles could afford perfumes from the East attar of roses, jasmine oil, myrrh, and frankincense. They anointed themselves not to clean, but to mask. They burned incense not for air, but for aura. Their beds were softer, but their sheets were washed less than one might think. Linens were expensive, so they slept in sweat. In towns, public bathhouses offered brief respite. One could pay a small coin to sit in a hot tub, scrub with a strigil, and share space with others. But these houses were also social spaces, places of gossip, flirtation, and sometimes sin. As plague fear rose, bathhouses closed or were condemned. The steam they once produced was now seen as sinister. What once relaxed the body now threatened the soul. Hygiene again retreated into shadows, and for the very poor there was no question. Hygiene was what you could do when your children were fed. It was what you could do when your roof didn't leak. It was what you could do when the snow melted and the stream thawed. Water, when not fetched in buckets, was collected in barrels from roofs. It was rain or runoff, and it was precious. Every drop had to matter. A child's hair was washed in leftover soup water. A woman might clean her feet in the same basin her husband had shaved in. And yet, they held each other close. They shared warmth, smells, survival. It wasn't seen as filth. It was just life. Even among scholars, hygiene was misunderstood. The great medical universities of Salerno, Montpellier, and Paris taught theories more than truths. Students memorized Galen and Hippocrates, debating the virtues of bile and blood, but knew little of infection. Anatomy was learned from pigs, not people. Dissection was rare, if allowed at all. So doctors prescribed diets, bleeding, and rest not cleanliness. Surgeons learned by doing. Barbers sharpened razors on their aprons, not cloths. And childbirth, still mostly handled by women, was the domain of whispers, herbs, and prayers. No gloves, no washing, just blood, breath, and the chance of death. But not all was ignorance. Folk wisdom carried hygiene in strange containers. Birch leaves boiled in water could soften skin. Vinegar rinses kept lice at bay. A slice of onion worn around the neck was believed to draw out illness. Nettle and wormwood were strewn on floors to repel bugs. And lavender. Always lavender was the scent of hope. It was placed in pillows, hung in kitchens, pressed between pages. Where soap failed, scent remained. And amid all this, there were moments of grace. A mother combing her daughter's hair beside a hearth. A grandfather washing his hands before breaking bread. A young couple splashing water at a well, laughing despite the filth. These were the rituals that mattered. They weren't antiseptic. They weren't pure, but they were human. And in them, we find not just dirt, but dignity. If we look closely at the later Middle Ages, we begin to see something quietly profound. Despite the overwhelming squalor, there were scattered efforts, isolated sparks of awareness, and tender attempts to improve hygiene, not from textbooks or kings, but from the daily perseverance of people who simply wish to live better. In towns and villages, midwives began recording simple notes, not formal treatises, but scribbled charms and remedies in the margins of prayer books. These women, often dismissed by the church and overlooked by men, knew where to place herbs in boiling water, how to clean the umbilical stump of a newborn, how to soothe a mother's fever with damp cloths soaked in elderflower. Their hands were stained, their voices soft, but their impact quietly shaped the beginnings of maternal hygiene. No university honored them, but entire generations lived because of them. Elsewhere, in monastic hospitals, monks and nuns began to keep records of disease. These were not scientific journals, but chronicles lists of the ill, their symptoms, their smells, their recoveries. Patterns emerged. Certain plagues followed the trade routes. Certain wounds festered if left exposed. Washing, when it could be done, seemed to help. These notes were shared in letters to other monasteries. Sometimes they were ignored. Sometimes they were read with curiosity. A few monks began to boil their instruments before using them again. It wasn't sterilization, but it was a start. In the homes of artisans, the idea of clean tools became tied to reputation. A butcher whose knives gleamed sold more meat. A tailor who brushed his fabrics gained trust. Hygiene, in this way, evolved not as an ideal, but as a tactic: cleanliness as survival, as marketing, as craft. Shoemakers, who soaked hides in foul-smelling vats, began to rinse their hands with vinegar before greeting customers. Bakers swept their floors more regularly. Smiths washed soot from their faces before church. These were small gestures, but they were conscious. Something was shifting. In coastal towns where sailors returned from long voyages, new scents arrived: cinnamon, clove, lemon oil, imported not just for flavor, but for their perceived medicinal properties. Apothecaries began to blend these into oils and tinctures, sold to the wealthy as elixirs and balms. The poor mimicked what they could, rubbing lemon peels on their hands or sprinkling ground spice into water. These aromas didn't cleanse, but they lifted morale, and sometimes, in a world that reeked of death and dung, that was enough. In bathhouses that still operated in secret or behind bribes, rituals persisted. Hot stones were poured over with water, creating thick, humid steam. Bodies sweated, relaxed, expelled. Attendants offered coarse cloths to scrub away dead skin. Women braided each other's hair. Men shaved in polished bowls. It was communal, vulnerable, and fleeting. The church might frown, but for a few hours, people felt reborn. And in silence, they returned to their filth, carrying a memory of warmth. In the palaces of the elite, hygiene was twisted into performance. Queens had maids who washed their feet with rosewater. Courtiers dabbed their wrists with imported perfume. Banquets were preceded by servants offering bowls of scented water for guests to rinse their fingers. These were not acts of sanitation, but of spectacle. Still, they echoed something deeper: a longing to be clean, to be cared for, to rise above the stink of everyday life. Even in the margins, there were rebels of cleanliness, wandering healers who advised boiling water before drinking it, priests who insisted that confession be followed by a literal washing of the hands, school teachers who made their students scrub the slate boards after every lesson. A few towns passed laws demanding waste be dumped only in certain canals. A few streets hired sweepers. A few houses placed flowers at their thresholds, not just for beauty, but to mask the rot. These were not widespread revolutions, but they were seeds. The human body has an instinct: it recoils at rot. The medieval mind might not have understood bacteria, but it recognized patterns. Children who drank from the cleanest well lived longer. Rooms with fresh air felt safer. Clothes hung in the sun smelled better. Mothers knew this. So did fathers and grandmothers and midwives. Even the filthiest alley had someone who swept it. Even the most crowded hovel had someone who lit a sprig of rosemary in the corner. Even the sickest ward had someone who wiped the brow of the dying. Hygiene, in its truest form, was not about being spotless. It was about trying. In a world with so little, effort became grace. And this effort, repeated quietly across centuries, gave way slowly, imperfectly, to the beginnings of what we now call cleanliness. Because while the Middle Ages were indeed dirty, smelly, and often revolting, they were also full of people who loved, who hoped, and who tried. And in the end, that's what hygiene really is: care made visible. As we approach the final chapter of this quiet, grimy journey through medieval hygiene, we must return once more to the root of the matter: the body. Not the sanitized, idealized version we imagine today, but the lived medieval body, exposed to the elements, shaped by labor, cloaked in odors both familiar and strange. It was a time when one's physical existence was not hidden behind products and polish, but laid bare to wind, smoke, sweat, and soil. And in this body, fragile, enduring, unwashed, we find the last lessons of the medieval world. To be alive in those centuries was to constantly negotiate discomfort. Underwear was rare. Clothes were worn until they unraveled. Itchy wool in summer, wet wool in winter. Leather hardened by sweat and sun, rubbing sores into skin. Parasites were inevitable: lice, fleas, bedbugs. Children slept beside livestock. Couples shared beds with in-laws. Privacy was a luxury most never imagined. Hygiene was not just a struggle, it was a daily, unending condition. The scent of medieval life was its own language. Smoke from hearths clung to hair. Grease from meals smeared across sleeves. The iron tang of blood from slaughterhouses hovered in the market air. Fish, unwashed bodies, tallow candles, damp stone, manure all blended into an olfactory fog that never quite lifted. People noticed it, but they didn't recoil. Their noses adapted. Their standards adjusted. It wasn't pleasant, but it was normal. Even death had a smell. And it came not as a shock, but as a whisper familiar and expected. And yet, within this miasma, people still sought beauty. They braided flowers into their hair. They soaked their feet in herbal brews. They scraped dead skin with seashells. They carved combs from bone, etched with tiny designs of birds and vines. They took pride in their appearance, even when baths were weeks apart. Clothing was patched, but carefully. Hair was often kept long, oiled, and tied with ribbons. Even the poorest peasant, after a harvest, might wash in the stream, wear their cleanest tunic, and sit by candlelight with dignity. There was no concept of sterilization, but there was one of decency, one of ritual. Before a feast, hands were rinsed. Before prayer, faces were splashed. Before birth, water was boiled. Before burial, bodies were wiped. These were not just acts of hygiene, they were acts of meaning. They marked transitions. They honored the flesh. In monasteries, this ritualized cleanliness became spiritual. The washing of feet was not only for physical relief, but for humility. Monks shaved their heads not merely for uniformity, but for symbolism, the exposure of the crown to God. They bathed rarely, but they purified their hands before copying texts. The ink they used might stain their fingers, but the water reminded them of their purpose. In the great castles of lords and ladies, hygiene was layered with ceremony. Servants carried basins for guests to rinse before meals. Herbal poultices were prepared for swollen feet. Chamber pots were emptied regularly, not out of concern for cleanliness, but for decorum. Cleanliness was expected from those at the top, though rarely enforced. Often, it was merely illusion. Perfume instead of soap. Silk instead of scrubbed skin. Scented gloves instead of washed hands. But even illusions matter. They reflect a desire, and desire is where progress begins. Children, in particular, learned hygiene not through school books, but through repetition. A mother wiping her son's mouth. A father showing his daughter how to clean under her nails with a twig. Grandparents brushing tangles from hair, siblings arguing over who would fetch water. These lessons were absorbed not as rules, but as habits. And in time, those habits became customs. Customs became culture. And culture became change. Because by the late medieval period around the 14th and 15th centuries, we see inklings of a shift. Cities began hiring public latrine cleaners. Water fountains were built for communal use. Laws prohibited dumping waste in streets. Soap-making guilds appeared in southern Europe. Recipes for lye, tallow, and herbs passed from merchant to merchant. Bathhouses in Germany and Bohemia grew in popularity. Travelers from the East brought stories of Turkish steam baths. And though the plague still haunted every decade, people began to see a link not fully understood, but intuitively sensed between filth and sickness. They couldn't see germs, but they could see what happened when rot was left to grow. The body, always a site of mystery and fear, slowly became something to protect. Not just the soul inside it, but the vessel itself. To wash, then, was no longer just superstition. It was hope. And in the final breath of the medieval era, as Renaissance minds stirred awake and light cracked the sky of a long, dark age, that hope remained. Not clean yet, not safe, but ready. In the quiet before the dawn of modernity, the late medieval world stood on the threshold of transformation, not through grand inventions or revolutions, but through the persistence of small, daily choices. Hygiene, once an afterthought buried beneath superstition and scarcity, began to stir in the minds of those who lived not with luxury, but with longing. It was in the subtle shift of seasons that people noticed something strange. Those who drank from flowing water fared better than those who drew from still wells. Those who aired out their linens, even in the dead of winter, had fewer fevers. Those who burned lavender or rosemary during sickness saw fewer deaths. These observations were not born of science, but of pattern, and medieval people, as simple as their lives may seem now, were master observers. They may not have understood disease as we do, but they paid attention to what kept them alive. In bustling towns, guilds began to take more responsibility. Butchers were fined for dumping entrails too close to marketplaces. Tanners had to build their workshops outside city limits, not for the sake of smell alone, but to keep disease from spreading. Bakers began to wear aprons and cap their hair. The guilds didn't call it hygiene, but the enforcement of standards had begun. And where there are standards, there is structure. In homes, rudimentary cleaning became a sign of pride. Floors were swept with bundles of heather or straw. Walls were wiped with cloths soaked in ale or vinegar. Furniture was simple, but kept in place, neat, arranged. Those who could afford it placed rushes on the ground not merely for insulation, but because they could be replaced, swept away when foul. The wealthy added dried flowers and herbs among the rushes: chamomile, sage, sweet flag, not to disinfect, but to mask the world. Still, the effect mattered. A cleaner smell meant a calmer guest. A calmer guest meant a smoother meal. A smoother meal meant peace. And peace, in those days, was a tree. Sure, women continued to lead these quiet revolutions. In kitchens, they scalded pots and stirred stews with clean spoons. In gardens, they grew sage and thyme not just for taste, but for poultices and infusions. In bedrooms, they shook bedding, tucked in corners, rubbed wool with vinegar. They knew the smell of death, and they fought it with ritual. Their work was invisible, unrecorded, but in every home it formed the backbone of survival. The rhythms of cleanliness were as natural as sunrise. On market days, people wore their cleanest clothes. On Sundays, faces were scrubbed. On feast days, fingernails were trimmed. Not every day was a clean one. Most were not. But when effort was made, it meant something. A clean child at the church steps, a washed face before the midwinter feast. These were not acts of vanity. They were offerings to a world too cruel to promise comfort. Even in prisons, there were glimpses of hygiene. Some jailers allowed water for washing. Some scribes recorded the illnesses that spread through the dungeons and tried to separate the sick. Clean straw was laid in cells once a week. Chains were wiped with lye. It wasn't enough, but it was more than nothing. And more than nothing in that world was hope. The church, despite its contradictions, played a strange role in this shift. While it discouraged bathing for pleasure, it encouraged cleanliness before holy rites. Pilgrims washed in rivers before visiting relics. Monks cleansed their hands before meals and scripture. Cathedrals installed stone basins for ritual purification. Even exorcists believed that dirt on the body could invite demons, so washing became a form of spiritual armor. These contradictions were not resolved. They existed side by side, because that was how the world worked then. Layers of belief, layers of need. Layers of dirt. The aristocracy continued to lead from their perfumed towers, but even they were not immune. When plagues swept through cities, nobles fled to the countryside not because they understood contagion, but because they knew that filth bred death. Their country manors, with cleaner air and fewer people, were safer, and slowly, very slowly, they began to fund improvements. A fountain here, a paved street there, a wall to keep refuse from the river. These were not acts of charity. They were acts of fear. But fear, too, can build. Travelers brought back stories of cleanliness from distant lands. Arabic texts spoke of ritual washing 5 times a day. Indian merchants described spices used not just in cooking, but in preservation. Chinese visitors spoke of bathhouses with hot stones and herbal teas. These tales inspired curiosity. And curiosity at last inspired imitation. Medieval Europe began to look outward, not to abandon its ways, but to borrow. And in the quiet corners of scriptoriums and city halls, recipes for soap were copied. Instructions for boiling water were debated. Laws about street waste were written, challenged, and passed. Bit by bit, a new idea emerged, that the world could be made better, not through miracles, but through method, not through purity, but through persistence. Hygiene was not yet science, but it had become a practice. And practice, repeated long enough, becomes culture. And culture, repeated long enough, becomes change. As the medieval world gave way to the early stirrings of the Renaissance, the echoes of centuries of grime, ritual, superstition, and struggle clung to the people like the scent of old smoke on wool. But something had changed, not overnight, not with proclamations or inventions, but slowly, as if the land itself began to exhale after a long breath held in the shadows of ignorance and fear. Hygiene, once thought the domain of the divine or the damned, had become something more earthly, more human. In cities, stone by stone, infrastructure began to evolve. Public bathhouses, once denounced, then tolerated, then forgotten, found their place again, not as dens of sin or shame, but as places where health could meet humility. Heated by fire, fed by river or well, these spaces offered respite to laborers and merchants alike. Men and women, though often separated, found in warm water not only comfort but relief from the burdens of their days. And while soap was still a luxury, lye and ash were enough to scrub away the filth of the week. To bathe was not yet to be clean in the modern sense, but it was to participate in a ritual of self-recognition. And recognition, after all, is the beginning of care. In universities, newly founded or reborn from ancient roots, physicians and scholars began to write not only about the stars and the balance of humors, but about the body as a thing worth knowing. Translations of Arabic and Greek medical texts introduced new ideas about contagion, quarantine, the relationship between cleanliness and disease. They didn't have microscopes, they didn't know bacteria, but they began to grasp that waste, and rot and filth carried more than odor they see, arid consequence. And so, public health began its long, uneven birth. Town councils debated sewage. Taxes were levied for street cleaning. Laws forbade the keeping of pigs in crowded alleys. Wells were covered. Latrines were moved farther from water sources. These were imperfect steps, often ignored, unevenly enforced. But each one whispered of a world trying, inch by inch, to lift itself from the muck. Within households, hygiene became a marker of virtue. Mothers passed down recipes not just for broth and bread, but for cleaning salves, vinegar rinses, aromatic oils. A good wife was praised not just for her cooking, but for the cleanliness of her hearth. A good father taught his son to wash after labor, to trim nails, to brush dirt from boots. These were lessons given without books, enforced without punishments, taught by repetition day after day until they became second nature. Cleanliness was not yet a science, but it was becoming a memory, something the next generation would expect, even if they could not explain it. In the countryside, where change came slower, rivers and streams remained the primary source of washing. But even there, habits shifted. Livestock pens were moved further from wells. Tools were wiped down after use. Milk pails were rinsed, then set in sunlight. The sun, always watching, had become a quiet ally in the war against filth. And though rural life remained hard, it was not untouched by the winds of change. Pilgrims who traveled returned with tales of cleaner towns. Soldiers brought habits from foreign lands. Traders offered soap carved into shapes, roses, crosses, animals wrapped in cloth, infused with lavender. These were tokens not of wealth, but of possibility. And possibility, once seen, cannot be unseen. Even the church, slowest to change, began to adapt. Baptismal fonts were kept cleaner. Holy water was replaced more often. Churches installed small wash basins near entrances, not just for ritual, but for practice. Priests began to speak of cleanliness as next to godliness, not in doctrine, but in tone. The line between the sacred and the sanitary blurred, and in that blur, something new was born. Not holiness, but health. And while medieval people still feared the wrath of God more than the reach of a germ, they had begun to see that the world could be managed. That disease, though mysterious, responded to effort. That rot, though constant, could be pushed back. That the body, though frail, deserved care. By the time the medieval period truly ended, sometime between the fall of Constantinople, the spread of the printing press, and the voyages that would redraw the map, the legacy of hygiene had shifted. It was still rudimentary. It was still brutal. But it was no longer entirely terrible. It had become a story of adaptation, a slow, collective learning. A record written not in books, but in habits, passed hand to hand, home to home. And in this way, the dirtiest centuries gave birth to the cleanest dreams. They imagined a world where children would not die of lice-borne fevers, where streets would not run with sewage, where hands might be washed before meals, where water could be trusted. They did not live to see that world, but they laid the stones for its road. And in that quiet, slow labor, there is something beautiful,